Hi, my name is Scott Heron. I'm an Associate Professor of Physics at James Cook University in Australia. And together with my colleague John Day, we have developed and designed a Climate Vulnerability Index, which we'd like to introduce you to today. This all began for us as a part of the storyline of responding to World Heritage. But let's tell you about that as we go. A number of heritage interested organisations, ECOMOS, Cultural Heritage, IUCN Natural Heritage and United Nations bodies recognise that climate change is a big issue. So we also saw that there was no assessment tool that could determine the vulnerability to climate change for all of these different types of properties. So we took upon this challenge and we've responded to develop this tool that can be consistently applied for all types of protected areas, natural, cultural, combined, mixed properties. It's systematic. It had to be systematic, and it had to have a proactive component to define how we could respond now rather than waiting for change to come upon us. And importantly, it puts the climate impacts into context, so into context with other factors that could make properties vulnerable. Now, throughout this presentation, you will see some terms like OUV and World Heritage. We'll explain those a little bit, but please, in all of those cases, think about the values for sites. That's the key crux of this. It was originally developed for World Heritage and for outstanding universal value, but it is applicable otherwise. The initial framework that we began from was based on the IPCC vulnerability approach from the third and fourth assessment reports. But we modified that so that in place of vulnerability, it would be the values vulnerability or the OUV vulnerability for World Heritage properties. And we also incorporated some modifiers to these exposure and sensitivity terms. We'll touch on those briefly soon. We then added on, following on from some other work done from our colleagues and collaborators, to add a community vulnerability component that assesses the economic, social and cultural connections. Together, this entire framework is what we refer to as the CVI. But to begin, we have to start with our anchor point, our foundation, and this is the key values of the protected area. So this property of interest. For World Heritage, these key values are derived from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value that is recognised by UNESCO. For other areas, it may be another document that forms that. But in addition to those values, the high level or internationally recognised values, we also understand that there are significant property values that are in addition to those. And we want to recognise those and make sure that those are understood. To give you an example, these are pictures from a World Heritage property in the north of Scotland, the heart of Neolithic Orkney. And you'll see there that 8 specific values, key values for this property were identified. Among those, the 2 that are shown in bold were the principal or foundational values that formed a basis on which other values depended. To give you an idea of what we do next, we look at those values and we ask the question from this list of key climate stressors that we have identified together with other collaborators in consultation with climate experts that are most likely to affect different aspects of heritage. And for our first large application of the CVI in Shark Bay, Western Australia, the key climate stressors, the top 3 were identified as temperature trend, long-term changes, temperature events, short-term burst events, and the changes to storm intensity and frequency. For the Orkney application, there was some overlap, but there were different key climate stressors identified for that application. Most recently, our application in the Wadden Sea World Heritage property again identified the 2 temperature, the long-term and short-term, as well as the sea level rise aspect there, that climate stressor for that property. Those reports that you see the covers of on the right hand side are available online, and we can give you that information. There are some other descriptors for each of these climate stressors, some synonyms, some associated terms that may be familiar for people. And as I mentioned before, for the two temperature aspects, some of them happen over long terms, that's the chronic stressors, and some of them are short-term pulse events, if you like, and we refer to those as acute stressors. So what do we do with our assessment? We use IPCC thresholds to determine what the likelihood of exposure of the key values of a property to a particular climate stressor are. We also look at the sensitivity of those key values to the exposure, to those impacts from climate change, and we assess them using definitions that were based on IUCN. You can see in the top right hand corner our CVI framework mapping through here as well. In addition to those categories, we also look at some modifiers for exposure and also for sensitivity that can help us to understand how these factors are influenced. Those modifiers must be applied across the full extent of the property, not just to smaller parts. So that's one way that we incorporate the extent of very large properties. Some natural properties are very large, and some of the smaller cultural properties also. We use those two assessments, the modified exposure and modified sensitivity, and a customized worksheet that we've produced to feed into a risk matrix approach and assess the potential impact, shown here in purple. From there, we look at the adaptive capacity of the values in relation to the three key climate stressors. And these are factors like the resourcing and the technical know-how that exist within the property, but also we look at the effectiveness of those strategies to address the climate stressor that's involved. And effectiveness is an important point within this. Again, we take that potential impact and the adaptive capacity assessment in a risk matrix approach to produce our values vulnerability. And we output this on a traffic light scale, green, yellow, red. And all of those pieces come together. These are assessed for each of the three key climate stresses individually and then combined together to give a single values vulnerability for the property. The next stage, the lower section of the framework, looks at economic, social, and cultural connections. And this is an important way that we connect the heritage of a location to the people who are associated with it. We do this looking at the three elements separately. For the economics, we consider business types directly associated with the property. So for the Orkney example, we looked at tourism, heritage-related industries. We looked at research and education and goods and services. So they were the four business types that were assessed within that workshop, that application of CVI. We also look at the social connections, for people who have visited the property and been a part of that substance there, and what the important points are there based on some existing literature approaches. In addition to that, we also use cultural assessments. You can have a cultural connection with a property even if you've never visited it. And it's important to recognize that these are Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultural connections. Within the framework, we use this ESC approach to look at the dependency as the sensitivity term for the application, and we also consider the adaptive capacity of the community in terms of the economic, social, and cultural components. So here we come out of our values vulnerability assessment that's undertaken using climate data and the knowledge from experts together in the room to consult on this. We combine that with further expert consultation on the dependency of the community to arrive at the potential impact on the community that could come from changes driven by climate change to the property. We then take that potential impact on the community, we add in the adaptive capacity to arrive at our measure of community vulnerability. And that's the final output term for our CVI analysis. Here's the framework again, just to run through it. We look at a risk matrix approach to use the exposure and sensitivity to define the potential impact. That combines with the adaptive capacity to look at the values vulnerability. That in turn combines with the community dependency to arrive at a community potential impact, which combines with the adaptive capacity term to look at the community vulnerability. The first of two example CVI applications shown here is for the natural World Heritage property at Shark Bay, Western Australia. Using the property values and attributes, the key climate stresses were identified as air temperature change, storm intensity and frequency, and extreme marine heat events. And then using climate projections and the expert knowledge, the CVI process was followed to assess the exposure, sensitivity, determining the potential impact, assessing the adaptive capacity, and arriving at an OUV vulnerability that was in the highest category. In addition to that, we also looked at the economic, social and cultural components and followed through the CVI process, also arriving there at a community vulnerability level in the highest category. The second example is for the cultural World Heritage property, the heart of Neolithic Orkney, for which the key climate stresses were identified using the property values and attributes as sea level change, precipitation change, and storm intensity and frequency. While the vulnerability was not as high as had been seen in Shark Bay, the OUV vulnerability was still assessed in the highest category. When it came to the economic, social and cultural analysis and analysing the community vulnerability, the difference here was that the workshop group identified that there were more adaptive capacities and less dependency of the property, which resulted in a moderate assessment of community vulnerability. Each of these examples that we've seen have been outcomes from the full workshop delivery mode of the CVI, but we also have other shorter and less resource requiring options for the CVI delivery. You'll see down the bottom the thumbnails of the CVI framework and the area of that framework that each of these modes covers. In the left-hand side, as I've said, that's the full workshop, multiple stakeholders and multiple days. And that contrasts with the very right-hand side, which is a snapshot, a few number of managers and a consultation that can even be done in a remote delivery fashion. So there are many benefits that we see for the CVI process. It's a rapid framework, but it's systematic, it's transparent, it's repeatable, and it has scientific rigor. Importantly, it can help the administering bodies. For the World Heritage example, the World Heritage Committee and the World Heritage Centre, to understand the implications of climate change, but also help the individual properties to undertake their reporting. We found it to be an excellent tool for public engagement. People resonate with the process because of its transparency. And it's important to note that while it was originally designed for World Heritage, as we're seeing today, it's applicable to other formal and informal protected areas. Finally, we see an opportunity for a thematic approach. There's a lot of protected areas, and we see these ideas of a thematic approach. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more for a moment. We have already undertaken some analyses of climate vulnerability for coral reefs, for glaciers. We see an opportunity here for a cultural heritage thematic analysis, and perhaps that could be around fortifications, beginning in the Caribbean. To give you some more info on the CVI, we have a number of activities that are underway, some grants that have recently been received, some partnerships that have been postponed because of COVID, but others that are just beginning to find their way back to their timing. and also some presentations to other organisations that are interested. Finally, we want to acknowledge the many contributors and collaborators that we have with the CVI, including our workshop partner organisations, which is also why we're here today. So thanks very much. You'll see some email addresses and a website there for more information, and we hope to hear from you. Bye now.